enough, well, you can start looking at the gray goo type of scenario that he proposes as another form of disaster that could come with synthetic biology, bioerrorism, as he calls it. I think boring phrase from James Evan Pilato. But at any rate, yes, lots of very important issues being raised by this field of study. And of course, when we start thinking about the way that governments have always used false flag terrorism and things of that sort in order to kick off their wars and to start the next round of craziness and insanity and the war on terror and all of this kind of shenanigans that we've seen time and time again throughout history, well, to think of this type of technology in the hands of the very same types of people who have been in charge of these governments for a long time, well, that should send some shivers down the listener's spine as well. So lots of very important things to think about when we talk about synthetic biology, and I think that's been fairly well established by now. But let's turn to a different part of that lecture in which the good doctor here at the Hastings Center begins to start talking about the way that bioethics can approach this and how the bioethicists, these priestly professorial types who have come down from the clouds in order to solve all our problems when it comes to these moral quandaries, what they have to say and what they think along these lines of these types of consequences of synthetic biology.
There are issues that are basically consequentialist. They have to do with the outcomes, the risks, and the potential benefits. But you might also be concerned about synthetic biology on these intrinsic grounds, if you will. You might just see it as something that is in and of itself morally troubling. And so the question is, what to make of this kind of concern? Is that a legitimate kind of concern to have about synthetic biology, and could it lead to even to public policy restraining synthetic biology in some way? And in a nutshell, my conclusion that what I told the House was that yes, this is a legitimate moral point, but it's not going to turn out to be something that should generate restrictive policy. And this I'm offering is somebody who's attracted toward not attracted to the engineering kind of mindset. Well, someone who's attracted to a preservationist mindset. It seems to me that the challenge with this concern is to figure out how to articulate it. One way of developing it will be as a kind of religious, metaphysical, grounded concern. That we're doing something that is prohibited by God as we understand God's commands. And I think that's. I'm not going to argue with that, but I think that those kinds of concerns are not very easily incorporated into public policy. There's a gap there between concerns that are explicitly grounded on religious positions and public policy. And it actually turns out that whether people who come to synthetic biology from a religious background are opposed to it. The Catholic Church has officially responded to the JCVI announcement that a synthetic cell had been created by saying, well, this looks like an interesting line of work. They did not come out against it. Now, there's some work done by the Woodrow Wilson Institute which suggests that evangelical Christians are likelier to be just innately opposed to this line of work. If you develop this kind of concern not as grounded in religious positions, but just as a kind of moral point, and most of our moral arguments don't trace all the way back to metaphysical concerns. They're just objections that we try and get other people to see them the way we do. And many of us do have this kind of feeling about the natural world. We feel that species are to be protected and preserved, wildernesses are to be protected and preserved, and so forth. But here, I think that this isn't going to lead really to restrictive policy either, because the problems that you might envision, if you have a preservationist mindset, are going to be covered by the consequentialist concerns. If synthetic biology leads to environmental destruction, then that would be reason to have this intrinsic moral objection to it. But that kind of worry is also going to be covered by sort of straightforward concerns about public health. I wanted to say something about this picture. I gave testimony at the House, and then afterwards we were standing around. I had my bag on my shoulder and was about to leave, and this guy suddenly pointed at my hair and said, "I think you have a leaf in your hair." And I thought, oh, how perfect is that? It was my few minutes of fame, and I haven't even managed to comb my hair appropriately. And the idea that I would have a leaf in my hair seemed to be sort of in keeping with my own views about the moral concerns at stake. I also said at the beginning that the JCVI announcement was billed as not just as a technical advance, but as a huge philosophical advance. And the philosophical advance was supposed to be that it showed once and for all that vitalism, the philosophical position known as vitalism, had been proven wrong. Vitalism is the belief that living things aren't just material entities. They have some sort of non-material or spiritual thing going on in them as well, a soul or a spiritual essence. And what we now knew, according to folks at JCVI and some prominent bioethicists, including some friends of mine, was that this is wrong because we just created a microbe in the lab. So now we knew, nope, nothing special about life. Life is just a puddle of chemicals interacting in an organized way. But just as a matter of logic, this doesn't actually follow. If there's a God who breathes some sort of microbial soul into bacteria when they replicate, that God is also perfectly capable of breathing that soul into a microbe when it's created in the lab. There was actually a very analogous question arose when people were debating some years ago what had been established by making it possible to clone human beings. The question was, if you cloned a human being, would the human being have a soul? And it was sort of seriously proposed by a few people in bioethics. Actually, no, they wouldn't have souls. But I think that's an extremely hard position to hold on to. If you have a person, moral being, responding to the world as we are, very much his or her own person, why wouldn't they have souls? Similarly, microbes created in the lab would seem to have whatever special thing microbes that arise naturally would have. But this got me thinking a little bit about what would be the reaction to synthetic biology if it hadn't been hyped quite the way it was. If JCVI hadn't said, we've created life, we've created a synthetic organism. What if they just said, we've created a genome and stuck it into a cell and it's survived? Maybe there wouldn't have been so much of an outcry about it.
A very interesting and a very astute point at the end. Maybe there wouldn't have been as much of an outcry if the J. Craig Venter Institute had have framed their experiment in a different way, presented it to the public in a different way, so that they didn't really hype the synthetic life side of the experiment and just put it in more scholarly terms. Maybe the people wouldn't have been so excited about this, and maybe all of this talk about synthetic biology in recent years wouldn't have really evolved the way it has. And that's an interesting point, because that is is very much the point of a lot of the things that we've been looking at in today's episode. For example, when we start looking at just the way that this information is presented can really affect and influence the way people think about it. So that when Henry Kissinger talks in his deep professorial voice about how there's no difference between the left and the right on the phony political paradigm, then, well, that just sounds perfectly logical and reasonable and nothing to get interested in or upset about. But when you actually stop and think about what he's saying, it's incredibly marvelous. It's incredible that he's talking about that. But again, you can put the most extraordinary things in the most ordinary language in order to conceal what's really going on. So that is an important point that's being made there at the end of that clip. And I think we can demonstrably see that the speaker is applying that to himself as well in his own presentation, because we can see the entire way that he frames this bioethics debate about synthetic biology in itself really limits what it is we can discuss. So that, for example, when he says, well, yes, there may be moral arguments, there may be religious arguments, there may be things that have some validity to them that mean that we shouldn't be doing this because it is somehow morally wrong, it is ethically dubious, we shouldn't be doing this. Well, but that doesn't matter, because all we care about, all this that matters really is, well, what does this mean in terms of the policy debate about bioethics and what should be legislated? So by framing the debate in that way and saying, well, this should really only be about what kind of things can we propose that the government should legislate about, then it removes the entire debate, really, because then it doesn't have anything to do with ethics. All it has to do with is policy positions and white papers and recommending what government should come in and do or not do. And once you frame the debate in that way, then you're right. You can completely remove any discussion of a soul or whatever other aspects might come into this type of debate. So by simply phrasing it in a certain way, framing the debate in that way, he can actually control the course of that debate. And if you bring up other types of objections, then he might just say, well, yes, that may or may not be true. I'm not going to talk with you about that. Why don't we just talk about what this means in terms of the policy debate? And once again, I think that's an extremely important point about the entire bioethics agenda and the way that it functions, because of course these bioethicists are not merely talking to themselves. That would be one thing. They are very much involved, deeply involved in some cases, in proposing and making proposals and sitting on boards of government bodies that are then setting the legislation. So you and I aren't sitting at that table having the discussion with what the government should or shouldn't be doing with our bodies. But these bioethicists certainly are. So once again, when you start investigating their background and find that they're all eugenicists, maybe that should be something of concern, and maybe that should be something we start talking about as a society and drawing more attention to. So once again, let's keep listening to the enemy on that point, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better organization to start exploring, since I don't see anyone else anywhere in the alternative media exploring it than something like the Hastings Center. But on that note, let's move along. Still tons of information to go